Welcome all. Actually, good morning, good afternoon, and evening, depending on wherever you are joining. My name is Praful from Corrosion Radar and your host for CUI over Coffee. CUI over Coffee is a growing community which is aimed at promoting online discussions within asset integrity community to exchange experiences and ideas. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guests today, the thought leaders in their own respective fields, Claire Watt from Keffer and Henrik Anderson from Shell. Hi, Claire. Can we have a quick introduction from Claire first?
Hi, Praful. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Watt. I work for CAFA and I specialise in CUI. I'm part of a multidiscipline CUI competence team, and we focus on training and innovation. Before that, I had 20 years operational experience in the upstream oil and gas, corrosion and integrity management.
Thanks, Keffer. Thanks to Keffer, and thanks for joining Claire today. And what you have not said is you have some really interesting data and insights to show today to the audience. So I'm looking forward to that. Henrik, over to you. Quick introduction, please.
Good morning, here from Aberdeen. I'm Henrik Anderson. I work for Shell, and I'm the materials corrosion inspection lead for Shell in the UK, and act as a technical authority for materials corrosion CUI issues across UK and Norway. I've been with Shell for 16 years, and I look after a team of dedicated corrosion engineers, inspection engineers, that spend a lot of time and a lot of effort on CUI. So this is something that we're looking very much forward to hearing everybody else's view on as well. Apart from that, I've been in the oil and gas upstream industry for nigh on 30 years, doing various mechanical integrity issues.
Thanks, Henrik. It's a pleasure to have you here. And of course, you know, your experience and wide industry insights are very valuable to the community here. So thank you. So it is a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion we have today. Can we combat CUI? Now, we are not talking about how can we combat. It's a fundamental question. Can we combat CUI? Some of us have been combating it well, but many of the users and end users, they have been successful in managing it successfully, but there are gaps as well. So where are we winning in the fight, and where are we losing at the moment, and what should we do differently? I'm looking forward to this open debate today. So just for the audience, this is how we will spend the next 1 hour. We'll spend about 40 minutes in the panel discussions. We'll have a few slides shared, some good insights from the latest new research being discussed. And we'll have a few polls during that time to get audience perspective. We will share the results as well live. And that gives us about 20 minutes for question and answers. You can post the questions anytime by the question and answer tab. And also, if we will also aim to give mic to a few attendees who would like to talk and have interesting questions. So you post your questions and also click on raise your hand so that our moderators will know that you have something to add. So we will aim about 2-3, depending on the time, for an interactive discussion to give mic to 2-3 people. Our intention is to keep this start with a high level, but we'll go deeper as the discussion progresses, and as the question answer comes in, we'll go even further deep. This session will be recorded and made available to all the registrations. And so let's start. Everybody got a coffee, hot drink, or masala tea in India, kahwa in Middle East, mate in South America. You probably have a mate I especially like there. So lift your coffee cup, and looking forward to a great session today. So for a start, corrosion and insulation has been a major industry pain point. I mean, corrosion in general is a big point, but CUI has been identified as among the top issues. And for several decades, we have been talking about it. We are still talking about it in this age. So from my perspective, we need to take a step back, understand we have been combating it. We have been trying to combat it, but are we doing it right? What have we learned? What should change? So that's where and CUI has been a particularly aggressive chemistry, and because of the wetting cycles, and CUI has been a much more aggressive pain point, say corrosion rates, than many others. So I'm sure people are confused as to why still fighting with CUI when there's so much of abundance of data already, understanding, etc. So starting with Henrik, your opening remarks on can we combat CUI, and what comes to your mind?
Well, so what springs to my mind initially when I hear can we combat CUI is we haven't got a choice. Yes, we have to have a battle with CUI. Now, the definition of a combat is to take action to reduce or prevent, and that's what we have to do. So as an industry, we're doing many things, and this is where you go into the how, which I know you're more interested in the philosophy around the CUI today, but the how is really important because we have to look at the coatings and the installations that we deploy and the knowledge we have. And I know Claire is going to share some data later on around the time it takes and how we see these things develop. So absolutely, we can combat CUI, and we have to minimize the installation. We have to make sure the awareness out there, it's amongst all the operators, everybody that sees the CUI on a daily basis is there. And then finally, I think that it's a case of making sure that hopefully one day we will have a situation where the awareness and the understanding of CUI allows us to combat it. So yes,
so that's a great opening remark, Henrik. Yes, we can combat CUI, but it needs more concerted efforts, something more different, and hopefully we will be in a situation that we will win this fight and no CUI will happen. Moving to Claire, what do you think, Claire? I know you have some slides, great research regarding new research coming from you, KFER and TWI. So we are very keen to look at that research. So over to you, Claire. What do you think?
Thank you, Praful. So to complement what Henrik just said, yeah, I think we have the knowledge and experience to prevent the really big CUI failures, but it is expensive and it does take a lot of effort, and we really need to improve our CUI data share. Just as an example, in the upstream plant in the marine temperate climate, we can spend, a single plant can spend 10 to 20 million on an effective control scheme over the first 30 years of asset life. And that is to prevent isolated failures, which is how CUI presents. But each one of those failures, any single one, can cost 10 to 250 million. So it's worth trying to prevent them, but we still get failures. If you could you flash up slide 2, please?
So shall we have the slides, please? The research which Claire can show. So while yeah, so we have the slides up. Let's talk about slide
2, please. Yeah. Thank you. So
yeah, so over to you, Claire.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think what's really interesting, as part of the work we conducted with TWI recently, we reviewed all the published guidance in-house risk-based inspection planning and CUI control strategy methods, and found that actually there's quite a lot of difference between these different methods, different approaches, and we identified strengths and weaknesses in all. I think, and we published, we used industry data to do this and showed that there is room for improvement. We can tighten up our methods to prevent common errors, and some of them are very simple errors. I think, so you can have a look at our Eurocore paper. I think one of the main reasons why the guidance says different things is that it's dealing in different ways with a lack of quantified CUI data share. Yeah, you deal with uncertainty in different ways. And our paper explains a little about this. But it's possible to make improvements to reduce critical failures, all the critical failures that I've seen in our upstream industry. I think in some cases, risk-based inspection is not cost-effective, it's not affordable for assets. In some cases, it's not actually capable of, it's not enough in some certain circumstances, and there we do need to explore and leverage new technology. I think we'll hear more about that later.
Great. So let's move to the next slide.
So yeah, that was one of the main conclusions from the research work that we conducted, was that it's very important for our industry to contribute CUI data to move us forward. And we'll talk more about that later.
Great. So let's get back to the discussion, and meanwhile, let's launch poll 1 to the audience while we'll ask some questions to the audience. So thanks, Claire. While the audience is answering the questions, may I request all the audience to choose the appropriate questions. What is the currently control? How do you currently control CUI? And which industry do you operate in? Petrochemical or refinery or upstream? And where are your operations based? You know, which geographical region? That will help us correlate between different answers. But meanwhile, while audience is answering these questions, coming back to Claire, thanks for sharing very good insights. And I think your research is being cited very well. You know, the one which you presented last year in Eurocore, it's quite revealing that right from 1985 and even before, there have been guidelines and there have been you know, best practices being reviewed and documented. And now in 2020, also we have some documents being released, EFC N55, DNV 109, all of them are latest one and being updated as well. But we're still talking about CUI. There's some missing links which you want to highlight and keen to look at it. You are saying guidelines have been made, but we have a data gap, and that's where we need to collaborate more and more. Can you elaborate on that, Claire?
Just as an example, if you look at EFC 55, it deliberately abstains, or it has done so far, from giving any kind of specific methodology or guidance to follow to plan where, when, and how to inspect, in terms of inspection intervals or techniques, and it abstains from this for a reason. It tells you to use your plant data to work out what's best for your plant. So that's quite interesting. And on the other hand, you have API 581, which is also an excellent document. And that takes a different approach. It takes some data and combines it with some reasonable assumptions to try and predict coating life, corrosion rate, to plan inspection intervals, predict time to failure. But at the end of the day, what it doesn't tell you is what's assumption or educated guess and what's actually based on data. So in reality, all our methods are semi-quantitative, and I think they can be improved, well, I know they can, by leveraging all of our industry data.
So
and DG 109, DMV's, Frodo's, and the team behind it, that's a real step in the right direction. It fills a gap in the public domain, which is helpful for companies that don't have you know, their own methods and specs. But at the end of the day, all this guidance, and I think Frodo agreed in your last session, could be improved by looking at our data and sharing it.
So great. I think we'll discuss that as a next step. Meanwhile, let's see what our audience says. Last few seconds for the audience to choose the answers or in the poll, and let's see what the audience says. Can we have the results, please, now? All right, so the results are up. So the first question is, how do you control CUI? So periodic insulation removal, that's the main method right now, 41%. Inspection program leaning on guidelines. So follow the guidelines to periodically remove insulation. That's the main one, the 41%. Now 22% selected periodic insulation leaning on plant experience. So based on the plant experience, that's where probably Claire is indicating that we need to increase more of plant experience and probably improve the local condition experience. The rest of it, periodic insulation removal and inspection of demand relying on monitoring tools is about 8%. 5% people don't know. So now where are the people joining us today from? 22% from petrochemicals, 30% from refineries. So really half of it is downstream. Some of them LNG, power generation. And about, I would say, slightly less than half is upstream, offshore and onshore. So kind of we have a mixed audience today. That's great. And where are your operations based? So 14% from Asia Pacific. Europe and Russia are majority of our joinees today. Middle East about 14%, Africa 5%, and Americas is 11%. So we have a mixed audience, mainly Europe audience, but global. So this gives a context of the discussion that Claire, you mentioned it has to be plant specific, and that's where the guidelines needs to be modified, right? So with this audience poll, what do you think? What's your view of the practices which is being mentioned here? Insulation removal is still the best method, or are there better practices you observe?
Okay, sorry, I have some technology making a noise here, but it should stop soon. So are we into, just to clarify, are we into part 2 now? And you're asking me what I think we should focus and do more on?
Yeah, so based on this poll, what are the areas we should look at and focus on? For example, insulation removal have been a major method, and that's been evident from the poll as well. But you mentioned that there has to be innovation and modification in RBI and the more use of the field data. So can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and I think we are actually still learning about CUI. If we could show a slide here. Could we flash up slide 4?
Yeah, so let's have slide 4. So while we have slide 4 moving up, Claire, so over to you.
Yeah, so what really surprised me and ourselves and TWI when we were conducting our research is that our CUI prediction knowledge is, we're quite poor at prediction, but our CUI prediction knowledge is based on a very limited number of shared CUI plant data sets. And each one of these is quite well known and really important. It's taught us something valuable, each of these data sets. It's very difficult to understand from the publications what kind of plants this data is leveraged from, how it's been collected, and whether what it's telling you is relevant for your particular type of plant and where your plant is located. And such that just one more data set, that's data set number 5, is something that we produced over a couple of years. So that's quite a quick turnaround, and we were able to demonstrate something new and challenge key assumptions in some of the guidance, the published guidance. In fact, it challenged all assumptions in all guidance that gives any kind of timing, inspection interval timing information. So it's very powerful, and I think we need to. I think it would be very helpful for the industry to focus on projects that collate and share plant data in a consistent way that distinguishes between different types of plant, because they can have different process profiles, different temperature profiles, different hazard profiles for the majority of the equipment. And I think we know that there is a real promise in being able to isolate common factors for really early severe CUI, which can be picked up simply by post-visual inspection, which is quite a cheap form of inspection. One of the other things we learned, I think we published for the first time just how isolated CUI occurrence can be. This graph at the bottom here, affecting a very small percentage of the equipment, but affecting all equipment. And of those occurrences of CUI, they progress at very different rates, even at the same temperature. So it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack when you're trying to prevent failures. And that's one of the areas where innovation can really help. I think the collection of data can help tighten up our inspection and maintenance strategies. I think there'll be different strategies required for different types of plant in different climates. But one thing where we are looking for some innovation and help from technology is how to screen more cost effectively to locate severe CUI. Because if we could do that, you could reduce maybe 80% of the direct inspection costs.
Right. And you mentioned needle in the needle in the hay. So that's a very powerful statement that CUI may be very localized, but we are trying to do a whole lot of. The plant is huge, and we are trying to inspect a whole lot of pipelines to find a small area where CUI is. And that's been a challenge, right? And that's been a lot of wastage in money and safety.
That's right. And actually, the figures that I gave earlier actually do, the spend figures I gave earlier do actually focus only on the most critical equipment. So I don't think it's possible at this moment with inspection and maintenance to prevent CUI failures on utility systems and lower consequence failure systems. But, so we're talking, I do think it's possible to adjust timing based on timing of intervention based on leveraging our data. But you have to take, if you really want to find CUI and be sure that you found it, if you can't tolerate a single failure on a critical piece of equipment, you do have to periodically take all the insulation off and look and then reinstate it if needed. And that's why there's a lot of investment currently in technologies that can screen or monitor and pinpoint locations more effectively. The question
So before we move to the next slide, this is quite revealing information. Thanks, Claire. I would quickly get a view from Henrik on this data set, which is being shown here. What's your high-level view, Henrik?
So it's very much, and Claire has shared this with me before, and it clearly shows that the severity of some of these locations where we see CUI occurring, it's so severe and it's so rapid that the only way of doing or improving our situation is to be better at not just predicting, but to finding out where it is, and that's a big issue that we have. So at the moment, like every other operator, certainly in the UK sector, we have a strategy and we have a way whereby we are assessing where we think it's likely to occur, and then we have a consequence assessment that drives us to do inspection. And inspection is, as Claire outlined, very much a case of stripping insulation, because that is the only tool that we really have that is 100% effective.
Right. Thanks, Henrik.
And the cost of that obviously drives us towards all this innovation that we see at the moment.
Great. Thank you. I think it's a big issue, as you mentioned. We have to go back to removing the insulation, which is slightly primitive, and can we do better? So, Claire, over to you for the next slide, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to flash up a couple of slides to demonstrate where we will benefit from more knowledge. they represent data gaps. There aren't any published or shared CUI data, plant CUI data sets for in many situations that relate to many assets. In a lot of the data supporting the current guidance that's sprung up in the last 10 years comes from a certain part of the world, a certain climate and humidity. So that's high humidity, subtropical and temperate climates, marine climates. But not everybody is located in that area of the world, in that kind of climate. So I think CUI can be different CUI priorities in tropical climates closer to the equator, where you have high humidity. My old colleague Stefan Winnick, just as an example, in marine temperate climates, you might not have issues at ambient and subambient temperatures until 20 to 40 years into plant life, whereas in Singapore, Stefan realized that their first big CUI challenge was 5 years into asset life on ambient and subambient temperature equipment. The different priorities not reflected actually currently in the guidance.
Yeah,
and different plant types also can have the majority of their equipment can have different temperature profiles, operating temperature profiles, and that can change, that can govern, different plants. One size doesn't fit all. They can have.
Yeah, so I find this chart very, very powerful in what you're trying to convey, Claire, that a lot of data and guidelines are based on a very limited set of experiences, especially Northern Hemisphere, but there's a majority. The problems are in the temperate and tropical climate, which is around the equator in certain geographies, and the corrosion rates are probably much higher there because of the tropical climate, humidity, temperatures, and that's not necessarily being considered in the guidelines. And that's where probably RBI gets limited, and probably that's where the collaboration and the new set of data is required, right?
Yeah, interesting projects going on. For example, the orange circles here, there's been some recent interesting work in Malaysia, in China, and in Japan. The Malaysian work was published, actually, Fran Chalmers from PIM sent me the paper. Petronas sponsored, I think, and that paper is really interesting. And they looked at their plant data across 3 upstream gas processing plants, and revealed that they could use that data to significantly increase the success of their inspection and maintenance plans and reduce costs.
Right.
And they also found that the CUI occurrence was affected a very small proportion of the equipment. So again, you're there, with the needle in the haystack issue.
Right.
If you flash up the next slide, there are other data gaps which are just as important.
Next slide. Right.
Yeah, and that's the performance of some of the, it can take 15 to 30 plus years for CUI problems to reveal themselves if you haven't inspected effectively. That's a long time to wait. And we're trying to hit a moving target because a lot of these newer technologies, some have been deployed for around about 15, 20 years now, in a more widespread fashion. But in the main, we don't have enough data. None of those data sets that I showed you are related to stainless steel, thermal spray aluminium, and different types of, some of the newer types of cladding and insulation systems. So we do need our plant data moving forward to show us how these different solutions perform in the field. And our experience can show conflicting experience with, for example, TSA. And that's probably because each of these solutions have strengths and weaknesses. and we still are learning about where best to deploy them. Some of them
Yeah, I
really
think that's
effective.
that's my question for the next part 3 of that, and we'll come to this slide again. Um, uh, let's move back to our discussion, removing the slide. And meanwhile, let's launch a poll 2 for the audience. So thanks, while the poll is being launched, thanks Claire for sharing the insights here. Quite a lot of insights coming in that, it's a lot of data from the tropical region is not being considered. And that's where the opportunities are to improve the practices. So let's look at the poll here. Is CUI management getting enough investment from your company clients in these times? There are 4 options. Yes, keep going with the current controls. Yes, although need to adapt current controls. The third option is no, I don't know how we can change. And the fourth option is no, although a new case is being considered, being proposed in your facilities. So I will give some time for the audience to choose an option. Meanwhile, coming back to Henrik, Henrik, while we are waiting for the audience, from the slides which you which you saw from Claire and the discussions, what's your view on this data gap, and also the tools in the arsenal, and then tools we'll discuss in part 3 shortly. Henrik.
I think it's something that we see generally in a lot of guidance, in a lot of areas that we deal with, but because it's a global industry, we've got refineries, petrochemical plants all over the place, and the data gets, and the people that share data tends to be Northern Hemisphere plants, and that is a problem because we do get very focused on that. So I get a bit of insight through the wider organization that I work for, and so CUI, we see CUI exists everywhere. All our facilities, everybody has it, but the frequency and the severity of it varies quite a lot across the patch. And the North Sea, I mean, it's one of the areas, yes, we are suffering from it, but we're not nearly as bad as some other places. And back to what Claire was talking about in terms of how to get the data, and it's a lot of work sharing data because you've got to share data in the same format, because otherwise you end up with apple and pears. And I think that's where the industry would benefit as a whole if we can share some of that information, but it's got to be coordinated, and that is a real big issue. Even internally, we find it difficult to share data, so we're moving to a UK setup now that allows us to review the data in one format and therefore hopefully learn a bit from each other. But we see a big difference between our offshore and our onshore assets, definitely.
Right. So again, there's a consensus here that there's a huge amount of data available, probably some of it unstructured, but we are working in data silos. There's an issue within the companies to have a systematic knowledge base and sharing the data, as well as cross collaboration between different companies and different geographies to work together and understand as a whole system as to why this, so to say, industrial pandemic is happening on the CUI, where we are, and how we can flatten the curve. So on the CUI. So that makes us to move to actually part number 3, which is how can we find a needle in the haystack? And again, I will start with Henrik on this, that there has been a data gap. There has to be movement towards collaborations on sharing the data of the historical kind, but also this is an opportunity where we can start logging the new future data in a more systematic manner, more automated manner. So how can we find needle in a haystack? Henrik, how do you respond to this question, past and the future, and what are the best practices?
So from our point of view, that technology is where we are driving this. And at the moment, our only way forward and our only method that we really deploy extensively is to strip the insulation and do visual inspection. But certainly in some of our facilities, we are starting looking at various inspection techniques that enable us to see underneath the insulation. And that there are many, many technology developments out there at the moment that is trying to look into this for us. But The problem, and this is back to what Claire was saying about that it's a very unique locations that this happens, and it's very difficult to identify the individual location. And the problem with a lot of the techniques is that they average over large areas and things like that. So actually, we can miss things. And CUI, because it's so severe, we can't afford to miss it. So going forward, one of the things we're very keen on, and what we're looking a lot at, is that if we can understand the conditions under which CUI might happen, and then that will allow us to at least know whether we have the conditions where CUI, so we can focus where we do the strip at the moment.
Right.
But I'm looking
Okay.
forward to our audience coming up with good new technology that allows us to do this remotely without stripping installation. 90% of the cost of our program is installation, stripping, and refitting, not the inspection.
So that's a great revelation that, majority, probably 90% of the expenses going towards insulation removal. Can we do it more automated with the data insights and just laser focus on the areas where it is required rather than blindly removing everywhere? And that comes back to, slide number 6, which Claire shared. Can we have that slide back? And then I'll pass back to Claire on revealing her insights from slide number 6, the tools in the arsenal which we have to fight CUI. So over to you, Claire.
I think I agree with Henrik that it's just, again, you move back. We do have a modern day CUI toolkit, that it either extends, products that act as barriers, more effective barriers that extend time to failure. There's a lot of myths surrounding what kinds of insulation and cladding are more effective than others. But at the end of the day, it's quite interesting. If you look at DMV RPG 109, that clearly says there's no type of insulation or cladding system that can mitigate on its own CUI. So, the Exxon Chemical published data from America and the UK show on CUI failure occurrence in piping showed that there were just as many failures with closed cell insulation, which is expanded perlite, which is used at higher temperatures in the US, as there were with mineral fiber insulation systems used at those same temperature ranges in the UK. Some of the current funded innovation areas, again, thermal spray aluminium. It could be very, very effective, a twice lifetime solution, maybe in certain temperature ranges. We've got more to learn about this when it's operating at higher temperatures. There are also funded projects ongoing at the moment to try and understand the reliability of non-intrusive inspection screening techniques. PEC pulse eddy current is an example. In some areas of the world, real-time radiography is being used with some success. But again, we don't really, the cautious operator really wants to know currently a bit more about how effective these techniques, how reliable they can be, because just one missed failure for some assets, for highly critical equipment, can cost several lifetimes of inspection spend. So I think sensors and sensor monitoring is an exciting new area. The Norwegians have actually put a lot of investment into the use of sniffer dogs, where gas samples are taken from inspection ports in the installation systems and sent off to the lab for dogs to sniff out corrosion. But again, we've got very little published experience over a long enough period to be able to understand whether this is the actual silver bullet we're all waiting for.
Yeah, it's quite important that there are so many tools, right, from coatings, TSA, to inspections, to different types of insulations. But as you rightly pointed out, that it takes a long time to validate the prevention methods, and so we need faster ways, probably learning from the historical and collaborations, as well as, I particularly believe that the new data coming from the sensor systems, and some of the industries have been adopting real-time monitoring of data, right from moisture to insulation, wetness, and say corrosion conditions of the CUI, and that's one of the opportunities for us. So thanks, Claire. I think we will continue discussion on that, but let's have the results of the poll, which we shared, what audience is saying about their experience. So the question was, CUI management, is it getting enough investment? So 11% says yes, they keep going with the current controls. Obviously, it's minority here. But second highest is 38% of the audience says yes, they are getting investments on the CUI, but they need to adapt current controls. The current controls are not enough. So the third 13% says no, they don't know how to change, and rest of them 38% says no, they are not getting enough investment, and although there is a case being built for CUI. So it's clear that industries are focusing on CUI. Some of them are getting investments on CUI, some of them are not, but there's a change is required. So I think 70% are saying that they need to adapt, and they need new ways of doing it on the CUI. The current methods are not working. And this takes me to the next poll, which we can share, poll number 3. And this is giving us good insights from the audience again. What should we focus more on to protect against CUI failures? Is it data analysis, making better use of existing data and pull together? Is it collaboration, share data among different parties, different global companies, as well as different bodies? The third one is use of more monitoring to detect signs of moisture and corrosion before inspecting. And the fourth one is prevention is better than cure. So insulation, coating systems, use of them, but also proven systems there. So let's see what the audience says while audience is choosing this this answer. Coming back to our discussion before we wrap up the panel session, this is the last point of our panel session. Hendrik, what are your thoughts, closing thoughts of this discussion on the CUI? What is needed as a summary?
Well, I think, as your poll indicates, it's a little bit of everything, because we do need to get better data gathering to be able to pinpoint where it is we need to go and have a look at the CUI risk. But at the same time, new technology is definitely required. I mean, we need to be much better at localizing where we have the conditions under which CUI can occur. And if we can do that in smaller parts of the plant, then we can severely focus our efforts in terms of the inspection that we do after we know that there's a potential for it. But also, I think that the getting a technology that allows us to fast screen large areas for wall loss defects, which is a result of the CUI, will help us enormously. And there's a number of techniques out there that are doing it, but access, especially onshore plants, tend to have reasonably good access to pipes. But offshore, for instance, lots of pipes are hidden up under ceilings and in pipe racks and in very difficult access areas. So what is there to come, and what can we do to get better? And that's why I think the monitoring is so important, because I think that's our medium-term solution. The long-term solution is probably something completely different, but we don't know what that is yet.
So great summary, Hendrik. Change is required. New technologies needs to be adopted. The need for large-scale coverage rather than very spot coverages, monitoring in the medium term, and probably prevention in the longer term. So that's a great summary. Another point I take it from you is access in onshore is easier, but offshore is a bit difficult. But the problems are everywhere, both onshore and offshore.
That is correct. Yeah, we see it everywhere, and it's the access to onshore is not as restricted because we can get more people on, and therefore we can do things easier. But in terms of the risk of it, I mean, it's all about protecting our workforce and protecting our people, and that's the same onshore and offshore.
So it's not about cost only, reduction in the work scope, but also protecting people's safety first.
Oh,
Basically.
yes. Yes,
Thank you.
safety is paramount.
Claire, what are your closing remarks on this discussion before we actually see the results?
I would say I find this poll interesting because I would say it's a trick question. Because like Henrik said, you can't do one without the other. So you do need data analysis and collaboration in order to prove confidence in monitoring and prevention. And like I said, there are some existing tools out there on the market that coatings or monitoring systems that could really be very successful in some areas. So, for example, insulating coatings or TSA could solve a lot of the sweating issues on small bore connections in closer to the equator in hot, humid climates. But we need to be more specific about where we target a lot of our tools and solutions. So you need, in some assets, plants may not be able to afford to now, or for various reasons, for a while, a long time, to deploy some of these and install some of these devices. So their only option, therefore, is data analysis and collaboration. And like I said before, you can achieve quite a quick turnaround in making your method as optimum as possible without actually going and installing anything new. So I think, like, I agree completely with Henrik. You need a combination, and we have more. Yeah.
So collaboration and technology adoption, mainly to reduce the cost, increase the safety, narrow down the locations where CUI mitigation is required, and knowing that is important. So thanks for your comments. Let's see the results of the poll, what the audience is saying, real time. So that's kind of a split arrangement. Data analysis is required. 7% of audience thinks that make better use of data. Collaboration is the key. Another 7% says, yes, we need wider collaborations as well. Monitoring, half of it, the audience says we need to monitor, adopt moisture sensors, corrosion before inspecting. And that's something what Henrik was also referring to, that in the medium term, that's effective. But in the long term, I think that's what audience is saying, 31% about prevention. Like prevention is better than cure, better insulation and coating systems. And this reminds me of what Claire has been saying, that it takes a huge amount of time to actually qualify the prevention methods, several decades. So how can we make it faster or turn around faster by using knowledge base of the past? And also, of course, use of structured data sets through monitoring. So that's quite good insights from the audience as well. And that brings us to the to the end of the panel discussion, and we'll move to the question answers, take some questions from people. But before we move to that, any quick thought, Henrik, on this poll that you see?
So it very much reflects what I expected and what I will see. I think that the prevention side of things is the problem with the pure prevention only is that unless you have the data that shows that you actually cured the disease completely, then you do have to test and monitor. I think somebody said test.
All right. So test for flatten the curve, and we need to narrow down to the locations which are infected by CUI. Claire, what do you think of this poll?
Yeah, again, as expected, I would add that every new technology that's come onto the market in the last 70 years, we have eventually discovered in the field its strengths and its weaknesses, and there will be targeted deployment success. So, for plants that suffer from severe CUI eventually or early on at lower temperatures due to sweating, that insulation is probably wet all the time, and so detecting moisture alone is probably not going to help. You need to understand timing as well. But again, I think where you get the most severe CUI occurrences at the higher temperatures and a lot of climate, definitely moisture sensing is very promising. I think as an industry, we have a responsibility to try things. Well, you don't try it, you don't know how effective it's going to be. And the big question is, how much do you trust it when it's being deployed before you relax your inspection costs, traditional inspection costs? And that depends very much on your hazard profile, as Henrik said. Safety for a lot of assets.
Thank you, Claire. So it's a great problem. I mean, difficult problem, finding needle in the haystack, and we need all our arsenal and the tools to combat CUI. Here is the first question. I mean, there are a bunch of questions audience have mentioned. One question is, in CUI, there is possibility by moisture buildup into the insulation, which leads to CUI, or even due to internal steam leak. How do we approach the problem? Do we look into the risk of the asset from the RBI, because it's a design-driven process, but it does not consider the actual water presence? Or do we inspect it by guesswork or time-based inspection? I think this is a very broad question. I think, Henrik, I will ask you this question as to how do you respond to this? It's a very genuine problem as to, should we focus on design-driven RBI or actual field, moisture, data, etc.? What do you think?
So I think it's a bit like what I said before, is that one of the things that we are focusing on is trying to find the areas of the plant where the conditions for CUI are the worst and are ripe, and moisture detection is definitely one of those. I mean, if we did not have the moisture, we would not have the problem. However, we know that we have the moisture. So to have an assumption that says that you have no moisture and therefore it'll all be okay. But likewise, that can drive you down the route of saying that, okay, so what's the worst corrosion rate you can get from CUI? And you apply that everywhere, and then suddenly you find that you have to inspect everything all the time. So from my point of view, you've got to look at your corrosion assessments, and you've got to look at your consequence assessments, and then you've got to manage the consequence. And this is back to the safety of people. So where is it is really important, and where is it that you're willing to take a bit more of a risk-based strategy without doing RBI? It's not a case of calculating half-lives and do inspection at half-lives and things like that. It's just, we don't have enough data and we don't have enough knowledge at the moment to do that.
Right. Okay. Claire, actually, this is a good question for you as well. On the RBI side, the question highlights the gap in the RBI and not able to tackle the real field conditions. So how do you respond to this?
We definitely have the existing knowledge to be able to create a risk picture of where our risks are greatest on our plants. A lot of people, a lot of plants, every company I've ever worked for has had problems or blindness with creating these risk pictures. Consequence is key. One of the things we suffer from in our industry is the tendency to try and over predict, or try and predict based on assumption and not data. So we are limited in prediction, but there's a lot we can do to leverage our data from similar plants and similar climates to really enhance this prediction. So as Henrik said, some of the highest corrosion rates that we've seen in the North Sea come from offshore, from glued insulation systems. Insulation that's glued onto the vessels, and in fact, they're the only that and vessel insulation support rings and stiffening rings. Those are examples of the use of certain types of cladding without drain holes and drainage. We can pick all these things up and identify them to rule out some of the pick up the early, really severe CUI cases, and that enables us to optimize the inspection intervals for the remaining equipment operating at different temperatures. So you get some tools that you can use if you share data between similar plants in similar climates.
Yeah, so the plant data is the key here because each plant is different in different regions, so they have different experiences.
Can I just say, there's a lot of valuable experience out there. Individual plants are really knowledgeable, particularly onshore plants, you know, where you get less changeover of staff for the long periods, and we haven't leveraged it all.
We haven't leveraged the actual knowledge base sitting in the plants.
That's
So this also brings me to this point that we are in the last 5 minutes officially, but if there's so many questions, so many of them we will get back on the emails. But also if the panel members, some of them are available, Claire and Henrik, can we extend it beyond by a few minutes if you're available to answer some of the queries? Are you available by a few minutes, Henrik?
Yes, I'm fine. I've got a bit of time.
Thank you. So Claire and Henrik, so we will tackle some of the questions, and so the next one, which is interesting, is let me read out to you, which is it is evident that coating is not 100% effective. So how reliable is coating on vulnerable locations to prevent CUI? Henrik, what do you think from the experience perspective?
It's a whole, this probably requires a whole another hour of conversation around the quality and the QA/QC on coating, because I mean, coating is fantastic. If well applied, good applied coating of the right quality in the right condition, dried to the right standard at the right dry film thickness, is the best barrier we have for CUI. But we do know that there's so many variables in that as well. That means that actually the coating thicknesses that we get are not consistent across our applications, but also the application methods. I mean, we can't just apply coating when the sun is shining and the weather is nice, because certainly in Aberdeen, we wouldn't have many days of applying coating.
So coating is not a foolproof solution, and we can't rely on it because there are so many dimensions of it.
We see CUI, I mean, we see systems that are perfectly coated and everything is fine, and then it has one part where the coating wasn't done well enough. And quite often what we see is that we see field wells where the coating has been applied after the field well has been inspected by MPI. MPI paint hasn't been successfully removed, therefore it doesn't adhere. And then you get a lot of localized corrosion in those locations.
Right.
So therefore the coating is not, it's not a foolproof barrier.
So, so then it needs a system approach. Coating is not a foolproof, but still we need it. But we need more information about the conditions around the coatings. And that's where I think, Henrik, you mentioned about use of moisture information and then monitoring data, which can help us augment that, right?
Yeah, so the two bits combined. So you have, you know how you're coated, you know the condition of your coating system, you got good QA/QC, and then you monitor for moisture and you find that actually it's dry in there. Therefore, the risk of CUI is very, very low. If you find moisture and you know that it was fitted offshore or in a plant condition or in a non-paint shop condition, then your risk is a lot higher. So maybe you need to go and look in those locations.
And that's where I think monitoring comes into picture as well, to localize the region where water is seeping in, which also means risk to the coatings. And the more the data, the better we are able to manage it. And I think that's worth a deployment. And the next question is actually about TSA. So I think I'll go with Claire on this first. So let me read it out. If I apply new coatings such as TSA on or apply new insulations, how would I know their efficiency over the years? Once installed, it is like a black box. Claire, how do you respond to this?
Well, firstly, every coating, conventional, immersion grade, TSA, there's a wide range of life distribution, yeah, from say and it's to do with the aggressivity of the CUI conditions and temperature, water and higher temperature, higher wetting, higher temperature, degrades, it gives you a shorter coating life, even if it's applied well. So yeah, thermal spraying aluminium, there are some fantastic reports of it being very successful for 40 years plus. There have also been very early failures reported, mostly from the marine offshore community. In fact, those are the only ones I've ever heard of. But yeah, if you apply, I mean, we typically in marine upstream, a lot of prudent operators upgrade their large columns with TSA coatings. You know, we've applied those live equipment when I worked for ExxonMobil, and then used sort of like closed cell insulation systems or aerogel with a non-metallic cladding. But then you're right. You know, how do you know how long or how much longer this system is going to last, and how long it is until you have to perform inspection? And I think at the higher temperatures, you have to be quite cautious. And still, you can extend inspection intervals a little, but you still need to inspect. So we're still, you know, a lot of these systems have only been deployed and in use for about coming up 15 years. You might have to wait, if you do no inspection, for 20 to 30 years before you start to see problems. So I would say that I mean, there is guidance out there for how often to inspect, but each operator is different. And I would say at the higher temperatures, you know, be reasonably cautious about extending intervals for this type of design solution.
Right. So it takes a long time, and to find out the efficacies, as well as TSAs have limitations in the field if you don't apply it properly as per the specifications. So that's also a valid point here, and that's where I think the more we get the data from the field conditions monitoring or inspections, and also combine it with the data from the past of various kinds from people, and we have a big database and knowledge base about efficiencies of the systems, like even TSAs and in various conditions. I think that's where we need. I think we have a good comment coming in again. Let me read out to you. More a comment than a question. A project I was involved recently with tried maximum prevention via high spec coating and cladding, and insulation was falling off due to water soaking of the insulation before the plant even started service. So you know, this is probably an extreme case that, you know, mitigation and prevention was put in, but you know, the insulation was falling off and water was getting soaked. Yeah, Claire, how do you respond to this comment?
I would ask the person who asked the question which area of the world they're in.
Oh, okay. Which area this is in, and what do you expect?
But I think,
this is...
I think that it's, you say it's a rare occurrence. I'm afraid it's not. I mean, we do see a lot of projects, because projects quite often get put together very quickly under time pressure, immense time pressure, and we see that insulation, well, you know what's okay, but we want to see in operating plants in that somebody puts the best insulation system money can buy on, and somebody walks across it on day 2, and then suddenly got dents and buckles and splits, and then it's not worth anything.
Right.
Yeah,
so I think, yeah.
Just to say, you know, some materials, some of the more recent insulation and cladding materials perform very differently in different climates. You can add to that challenge that Henrik just discussed, which is a very real one, because these materials don't deal well, or they're more difficult to work with and apply and achieve quality due to high humidity and temperature. You know, swelling issues, curing issues, so you know, that's why I asked, where in the world are you? Because, you know, but yeah, and a lot of operators are trying to incentivize, you know, these project managers to find ways to incentivize them to to achieve and maximize and promote good quality. And a lot of the guys, the workforce that are applying these products, you know, they're often not pulled off the street, but you know, big projects. There are people that are employed and trained pretty quickly in order to perform these services.
So I think this comment was from Breton, and if Breton is online and still, and if we can give the mic to him, let's hear from him what his experiences is, and I think that's from Australia. So that's a different part of the world from this area, and you know, probably the practices are different. Can we pass on the mic to Breton, please?
Can you hear me?
Hi, Brenton. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Yes. Yes. And
where are you joining us from, Brenton? And what's your experience of CUI? What do you?
Perth. But I've worked in refineries and offshore and petrochem and a lot of different. I'm consultant at the moment, not in an operating environment. But this project was in Northern Australia, but the interesting thing was that the coating was applied in many different locations, and the insulation was applied insulation and the cladding was applied on site. So we can't blame the coating failures on one particular, you know, bad acting coating applicator. So I found that most interesting, that we can't simply put this down to, well, you know, there was one applicator that was slack.
Right. So it's highly people dependent. That's what you're saying, that, you know, even if you follow the guidelines, what happens in the field, if you don't follow the procedures and proper coating, then the coating is no good. And I think that's where the problems as well.
I think I'm actually saying the opposite, that this particular coating, no matter where it was applied, and it was many parts of the world, the coating failed, and the insulation cladding failed once it was delivered to site. So it's not applicator specific. It's simply supporting the point that the choice of the coating and cladding does not influence the outcome.
Right. So that's a great point. Thanks, Brenton, for joining us from Australia. It must be quite late for you.
And I think Brenton's point is very valid, in that it does show that prevention, as in just saying, well, paint it with a bit of paint, is, well, that's a very, very difficult leap to take.
Yeah. So it must be quite late for Brenton in Australia right now. I mean, it must be quite motivated to join us today. CUI is a big issue. There, it seems like. Thanks.
Only 7 p.m. Not so bad.
Not that bad then. No. Thank you, Brenton, for joining us today. So that was the great insight from that part of the region, and that highlights what Claire have been saying as well. You know, that it's a global issue, and it's also about which regions we're talking about, what corrosion rates we should be talking about, etc. So I think this is high time we close it. Rest of the questions, I think we have to get back on emails, and panelists, I'll consult with you to get back on the emails. But you know, this has been a great session again today, yet another one. I think we are reaching about several hundred community members now, and I think we are touching about 1,000 to, you know, cumulative who have been associated with CUI or coffee, and I think that shows how much we should collaborate across the globe. So it was an interesting discussion today. Thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, participants.
Thank you, and we have all an important role to play in the CUI community. So for the audience, we'll be back with another CUI or coffee round. Meanwhile, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out at webinars@corrosionradar.com. Please subscribe, follow our LinkedIn page, where we will announce Corrosion Radar, CUI or coffee, and with the next set of panelists for interesting discussions. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Henrik. And thank you, audience. Stay tuned for the next session. Thank you.